Hi, guys. We're going to continue our story about Joshua. This one right here talks about the captain of the Lord's host appears. Who do you think that captain might be? Suddenly, as Joshua raised his head, he saw someone standing by him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua reached for his own sword as he moved away from the person. Are you friend or foe? Joshua asked, as any soldier would. Are you on our side or are you on our enemy's side? Neither, said the person. I am the captain of the Lord's host. The captain of the Lord's army? Thought Joshua. Then Joshua realized that his visitor was not just another man, but the commander of God's army of angels and the real captain of Israel. The one had come to give Joshua the help, the strength, the wisdom, and the courage for which he had prayed. Joshua bowed low, fell on his face before this person, and worshipped him. This one who appeared to Joshua was Jesus, the Son of God. In his pre incarnate appearance, several times in the Old Testament, Jesus appeared in visible form and talked with God's servants. This was one of those unusual times. What a privilege it was for Joshua to see the Lord Christ. The Lord told Joshua that he must be reverent in the presence of God. Take off your shoes, for this is holy ground. And Joshua took off his shoes. This was what the Lord had said to Moses at the burning bush. We cannot be reminded too often that our God is holy and righteous and requires us to be reverent and respectful in his presence. When we read God's word or hear it taught, when we go into his house or approach him in prayer, and even when we talk of spiritual things with our friends, we should be respectful. Let us remember, too, that the same God who appeared to Joshua is also the captain of our salvation. And in our heated battles against sin and Satan, with Satan's organized his fearful host, we must look to our captain. Let him give us direction and lead us, and know that in his name there is sure and certain victory. Then the captain of the Lord's host assured Joshua that Jericho was as good as captured, and that all its mighty warriors were already defeated. For I will be in the battle and in complete command, he told Joshua. This is the battle plan and strategy for taking Jericho. Your army is to walk around the city once a day for 6 days. They are to form a long procession with the thousands of armed men leading the way. They are to be followed by 7 priests blowing continually on their trumpets made from ram's horns, and the army of the people are not to say a word while they're walking around the city. Behind them are to come the 4 priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, followed by a rear guard of more armed men. On the 7th day, this procession is to march around the city 7 times. Then the priests are to blow one long, loud blast with their ram's horns, after which all the people in the procession are to give a loud and mighty shout, and the walls of Jericho will fall down flat. All of the contents of their city are the Lord's, the gold, the silver, the valuables, everything. No one is to keep anything for himself. After this wonderful and unusual visit with the captain of the host of the Lord, Joshua returned to camp of Israel. He now had a battle plan, and he could now give God's instructions to the priest and the army. These directions were very plain, but they certainly involved the most peculiar war measures that a military leader had ever known. It would take faith for the Israelites to follow these unusual instructions. Although the plan of action was contrary to man's wisdom and human judgment, because God gave the orders, there was no murmuring, no questioning, just implicit obedience. So the Israels, they're going to march. The watchmen on the walls of Jericho were puzzled. Ever since they had seen the Israelites cross the dry bed of the Jordan River, they had been expecting an attack. But none had come, and the gates of Jericho had been kept tightly closed. Every able-bodied man in Jericho stayed fully armed and ready for action at a moment's notice. Archers were posted on the battlements to shoot down any attacker, but none came. They knew that Israel had no big enemies of war to batter down walled cities, nor were they building any. It was all very strange to the people of Jericho. Were the Israelites planning to just wait and starve out the Canaanites? Then one day, the men of Jericho saw a procession forming outside the camp of Israel. "This must be it," they said. The soldiers of Jericho were told to secure their battle stations. They saw thousands of Israel's armed men, a group of priests carrying some strange-looking box, and then more armed men marching around their city. And men in special clothes were blowing horns continually, while none of the army of Israel said a word. It was strangely quiet of all human voices. The procession marched on and on until it had gone completely around the city. Then it went back to the camp of Israel. "That's a funny way to attack a city," said someone on the walls of Jericho. "Is that how they're going to make war? We don't have to worry about much, do we?" "I don't like it," said another person in Jericho. "Did you notice how quiet they were?" Nobody spoke a word. So far as I could hear, the only sound was those trumpets. Each day, as Israel prepared to march, Joshua gave his command, "Let there be complete silence, except for the trumpets. Not a single word from any of you until I tell you to shout. Then shout." At dawn the next morning, they went around again and returned to camp. And so it was the next day and the next, the same procession, the same silent march around the city. It was uncanny. The army of Israel followed this pattern for 6 days. "What are they up to?" many people in Jericho began to ask. "Do they think they're going to conquer us by just walking around our city like this?" Then came the 7th day. Early in the morning, the procession started. At first, everything seemed the same as the other days, and it was, until one complete circuit had been made. Then, instead of Israel going back to camp as usual, the soldiers and the priest walked around the city of Jericho again, with trumpets still blowing. 4, 5, 6 times. And still not a spear was thrown, not an arrow was shot, not a sound was made, except the noise of the priests' trumpets and the trampling march of their host. No doubt the people of Jericho were now wondering what would happen next. They were tense and the air was electric with anticipation. Around Jericho went the procession the 7th time. Suddenly, as the priests sounded a long, loud, ear-piercing blast on their trumpets, Joshua called the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. All that is in it belongs to the Lord." What do you think happens to Jericho? Yeah, it falls. Instantly, all the men shouted. The sound waves must have struck the walls like a battering ram, for at that precise moment there was a shuddering and a shaking as if an earthquake had hit the city. Then, by the power of God, the huge, great walls of Jericho began to crumble and give away. They fell down flat as an army of Israel continued shouting. The walls were down and the city was left wide open for the Israelites. So the army of Israel poured in from every side and captured the city of Jericho. Only one small section of the wall of Jericho remained standing. Do you remember who it belonged there? It was the section of the wall that had a house with a scarlet cord hanging out the window. It was Rahab's house. As the Israelites stood around the city, Joshua commanded the men to rush forward, climb over the rubble, and conquer the city and take it. Rahab, with her family huddled in the house on the top of the wall of Jericho during these days, she had probably said over and over to her family, "Don't be afraid. I believe we'll be all right. Stay with me, and it'll be all right." Rahab stayed in her house with the red cord hanging out until the soldiers came into her house and brought her and her family out. God spared this one family because Rahab believed God. God honored her faith and desire for God's purity and righteousness and for a different way of life. Rahab and her family walked safely out of the rubble of Jericho and came to the camp of Israel. No matter who a person is, if they are tired of their way of life and see that it doesn't work, that it only brings heartache and problems and guilt, they can come to God and believe on Him. God's way is the best way. It's the only way that works and gives peace, joy, forgiveness, and cleansing. God offers his way for every person who will come. Do you need to come to him in faith and confess to him that you are a sinner and telling him that you believe Jesus Christ died on Calvary's cross, our red cord, for your sin, and that he arose from the dead 3 days later and now lives in heaven? Great story today, guys. I hope you enjoyed it.